Rita Kakati-Shah, your host for the Show. Welcome to your one-stop journey for feeling empowered. We're a platform for change. We build confidence. We are your voice. We want you to be bold, be you, be Uma. Today, we're exploring empowering women in finance. And I'm so excited to be joined by a goddess of go-getting, Romita Shetty, who is joining us from New York, and she's the managing director of DA Capital. Welcome, Romita. It's lovely to see you.
Hey, Rita, nice to be here.
So let's find out all about you. You're from Delhi originally. Tell us about your upbringing and how you grew up.
You know, I grew up in a small family. I spent most of my life in Delhi, but my family is originally from Bangalore. And both my parents, it was a very close-knit family. We were brought up to be very confident. There was no real expectation. So unlike many traditional South Asian families, we weren't told you had to be this or that. We were but encouraged to be something. And so I think when I look back now, I never thought about it till, I was much older, but my parents did raise a degree of confidence.
Right.
And not a sense that you had to kind of take a step back or, be in the background at all. My mother's a very strong woman. My father's a very strong person, very encouraging of strong people. So it was a very good foundation.
Yeah, no, I love that journey, especially because you were instilled the values of confidence from a young age. We don't often hear that, especially when growing up in India. So I really love that your parents both nurtured that early on. So that's how you grew up. You then studied history at St. Stephen's College in Delhi. And you also hold a master's in international affairs from Columbia University. Walk us through your education and how that led eventually to a career in finance.
So as you can tell, there wasn't a lot of premeditation into a career in finance at all. But I was very interested in history. I actually at one point wanted to be a poet. Then I wanted to be an archaeologist. And I was very interested in international politics, which led to the degree in international affairs. Somewhere during the master's, I took a couple of finance courses. And I had an internship at a bank, and I was like, okay, this is kind of cool. It's a job, it pays money. And I loved New York. I had in the meanwhile gotten involved with a nonprofit that I helped start, and I had a lot of friends there. So finance seemed a logical way for me to stay on in New York and kind of continue that life. And I did enjoy my finance courses. And it turned out to be serendipity because I ended up in a job that I found very stimulating, interesting, right. and it changes all the time. At least in my career, it has changed in terms of what I've done. So it's always kept me stimulated. And so there was not a lot of planning. So I interviewed for jobs. And one of the first jobs that I got offered was at Standard & Poor's, which was a credit rating agency, which I had no clue when I joined them what a credit rating agency was. But it was an immense education in kind of all aspects of debt markets and finance. So it was a real good kind of starting point for me.
So thank you so much for sharing that. What brought you to the US?
As I said, I started out wanting to be a poet, then an archaeologist. I toyed with a lot of different things. And I ended up thinking that I was kind of interested in history led me to international affairs and kind of more current version of history. And, sad to say, I had a bunch of friends who were applying, so I just kind of followed the herd.
Right.
And the US seemed very interesting. I never come here before in my life. I'd been to Europe, but never to the US. And so international affairs seemed kind of a logical update on history and archaeology.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. And speaking of Standard & Poor's, so you started off there, you then went to JP Morgan, to RBS, to Lehman Brothers, and now you're at DA Capital. That's a huge financial trajectory where you've held very senior positions and you have over 30 years experience across fixed income and credit in particular. You run global teams as well. Walk us a little bit through that journey of yours in finance.
So as I said, I kind of went to Standard & Poor's as a little bit of a novice. I wasn't one of these people who always knew they wanted to be in finance. I didn't have a lot of family or friends who were in finance. So I had very few reference points.
Yeah.
which, is a negative in many ways, but it's also a positive because you kind of go in open and, absorbing what you're getting. Standard and Poor's was a great experience because I did all kinds of financial instruments, everything from municipal bonds to banks to asset-backed securities. And it was a relatively young organization. There were some very senior older people at the top, but there was a lot of opportunity for young people to move up. So it also gave me a chance to kind of exercise and develop into leadership, and ended up running a few businesses there, which was great experience for me. And what I realized out of that job is that I really actually liked kind of solving problems. I did not know that about myself until I had that job, but it did teach me that I like the intellectual stimulation of new products, new situations, new transactions. And the thought of doing something very repetitive was not something I was looking for. So when JP Morgan called me, it ended up being a very fortuitous conversation with the person who was my boss at that time. And he said, well, I don't have a job description and I don't really know who you're going to report to, but we're trying to create this new instrument called credit derivatives. And I was like, what does that mean? And he didn't quite know what that meant at that point either. I also had a competing offer at that time from Lehman, which was a much more defined job in a particular kind of financial security. And it was a no-brainer. Even though one offered more money, I actually took the JP Morgan job because the newness and the chance to actually create something with a team of people. And I loved everyone I interviewed with there, which, was a key factor in having kind of stimulating, interesting people to work with. And that ended up being a great kind of next chapter for me in finance, because I was at the forefront of creating a new instrument that is now kind of a mainstay of the financial markets, but did not exist at that time, with a group of very smart people. So it was a really interesting business. And that credit derivative job evolved into many different aspects of that, and a global job eventually. But it was one of the better calls I made to not take the higher paying job in a more defined area, and go to something that was new and seemed like a new frontier.
I love that journey. You actually take me back on a trip down memory lane, because back in the day in London, when I was at Goldman, it was around the time when CDS was getting started for the very first time that I got pulled into the team as well. And it sort of brings back memories of this brand new product. You don't know what it is. You're getting your teeth stuck in and understanding the concept for the first time. And there we go. We know the rest is history after that. So thank you for sharing that journey. You've had a really, really long and very successful run within leadership in finance. What's been your secret sauce, so to speak, for your success?
So I think the first thing, as I said, is being fortunate enough to be in jobs that play to my strengths, which I realized, as I said, was kind of, new products, new problems, and also being willing to deal with ambiguity and kind of, not very structured situations. So I was fortunate that I ended up being in businesses that encouraged that and actually needed that. So, but also taught me a commercial instinct in terms of how to actually take ideas and problem solving into business products that actually made money. And so I think I ended up getting great exposure very early on, and being in a situation where there weren't hundreds of other people who knew, what I knew. I ended up being relatively in a small coterie at that point of people who actually understood what was happening in those products. So I think that helped, having bosses who were willing to encourage young people or people who were not, at the firm for very many years into leadership positions obviously helped. But I would say the single biggest thing was picking a job that played to my strengths.
Right. Yeah. I love how you share that. Because you came from a history background and then you started something totally different on kind of international relations. How did you first know how to find out your strengths? And this is a question a lot of our viewers have as well, where you study one thing and you end up working in something totally different. So as you started in finance, you could build up upon that. But how did you first sort of hone in and work out what were those strengths?
So I think there's two kinds of strengths, right? Or two kinds of areas. One is domain knowledge, which obviously I didn't have any when I started in finance. And that I think is not that hard unless you're trying to be a astrophysicist to pick
Right.
up on the job. So I think one is getting good and knowing your strengths in terms of domain knowledge. You know, what kind of thinking do you like to do? Are you more analytical? Are you
Yeah.
more intuitive? But then there's also knowing your personality. And then it doesn't have to be a strength, it just is who you are. Your
Yeah.
willingness to take risk, your willingness to deal with certainty, uncertainty, your ability to make calculations, and what makes you happy. Because I think it's very hard to be successful if you're not kind of enjoying what you're doing. I mean, we sometimes can, and I'm sure we all have in situations which we're not loving every minute of what we're doing. It's hard to sustain over any period of time.
Yeah.
So I think some of that is by doing. It's, you know, it's kind of like being a sculptor and you're kind of working with different media, and then you suddenly realize what you actually like. You know, you really like bronze and not clay. And so I think some of it is being in the work world. Some people have a lot more self-knowledge as young people. I didn't. I kind of discovered it through doing. But then I was willing to run with what I perceived as my strengths, even in situations that seem more risky or not kind of obviously the right logical step. So trusting kind of my instincts about myself was something I developed over time, but it stood me in good stead for the most part.
Yeah, no, I love that advice you just shared, because it is so true for so many, particularly women out there. You kind of go into something and you hit this world where you're learning a new product. But to your point, it's those skills and being that willingness to learn and almost experiment with something completely different. And I think that's really, really important, that message there that you shared. So as a senior woman in leadership, were there any challenges that you faced while climbing up that ladder? And how did you deal with them?
I definitely had a few challenges. I had some bosses who were brick walls, were not that interested, who were competitive. It's very hard to work for someone who is competitive with you. That's always an issue. And I would say that the other challenge I had, is that I've never very consciously sought out mentors. And I think mentors can be hugely helpful.
Yeah.
And that's my advice to any young person, especially any young woman, is you need people who can kind of mirror back to you, what you're doing, how you could kind of, fine tune it, the nuances of what you don't always perceive about your situation. And so I would say that my one big challenge was I did have a couple of very good colleagues, very encouraging colleagues and bosses, but I also did hit roadblocks with various people at the, on the corporate ladder. And I think having more mentors and having been more kind of proactive about seeking out mentors who were kind of adjacent or outside my specific job would have been actually really helpful. So I would say in hindsight, that was the one thing that was my single biggest challenge. And I think a lot of women still face it. And I talk to young women all the time, and we're not that good about going out and putting people on our team. We're probably maybe better about doing that in the kind of personal and emotional space, but we're not that great about doing that in the work world. And I've seen that from friends who are artists to friends who are, in finance to lawyers. And I would say that that's the one biggest obstacle I faced. But every time I ran into a roadblock, I didn't have this effectively brain's trust to reflect back. I mean, you don't always take people's advice, but for someone to hold up a mirror and effectively show you, how you seem to the outside world is very important. So.
No, absolutely. And being really receptive to that viewpoint as well. Because, you're right. I mean, even when I was climbing up that ladder, so to speak, in the early days, mentorship wasn't even really that formalized term, certainly the early 2000s, So I think as you get experienced and as you climb up and go through the ranks, you start to kind of work out, some of the battles that are worth fighting for and other ones that kind of to let go of as well. But having that person, that champion, that mentor to guide you that's been there before, whether it's a man or a woman. My mentors, and I still have them to this very day, are split. They weren't just women mentors or men, they're both, because they both have very different experiences. But it was so invaluable to have that, and to your point, to see angles that you can't see yourself about yourself. So I think that's really, really good to have that reality check, as well as that guiding hand to help you through that workforce as well. So thank you for sharing that. And one more thing, actually, when we spoke previously, you mentioned a passion for human rights, advocacy, art, and music. In fact, you co-started Saki while at Columbia. And Saki, I personally love, because at UMA, we mentor and empower members. So it's something very, very dear and close to my heart. You're also on several boards, such as the Columbia School of International Affairs. Can you talk to us about your many outside pursuits?
So Saki was a very pivotal aspect of my life, because I was kind of young. I was, 20-something, in my early 20s. And I had always had a sense of, wanting kind of justice. And I grew up in a family that, as I told you, women were treated, very well, and with a lot of very strong women. And and being with a group of women to help start an organization was really interesting to me. It first made me more rooted in New York, which was a foreign city to me, and gave me a sense of actually wanting to be part of the community and change it. But it was also, it kind of encouraged organizational strengths to take a grassroots organization from nothing to, which I think it celebrated like 30-something years very recently. And, obviously that journey has been shepherded by many other people since then. But in the early years, we were a bunch of struggling students who effectively were trying to run a nonprofit in parallel to our studies and our jobs. So it was a real challenge. And it also showed me that you can actually organize effectively around injustice or an unequal playing field. And that's kind of persisted in all my other interests. And for me, I think a lot of the nonprofit organizations I'm involved with are really sustaining for me. I do them because I think those issues are important and I think I can contribute, but they're equally sustaining for me and for my spirit. Because if I only did my business job, I would feel very very monochromatic and a little bored and a little burnt out. So I've found that starting with Saki, it's just been a journey that has sustained me, and I've been trying to really think about where I can contribute, but where my spirit is effectively nourished. So and that kind of governs all the boards that I have joined over time. And
I think that's really powerful, that message you just shared about doing something that you feel very, very passionate about, that you love. Because to your point, when people do talk about burnout, it isn't just because you're necessarily overworked. It could be the monotony of what you're doing. So finding that outside pursuit, that's something that you're really passionate about, could be what it takes to kind of really help you, but you're helping another cause as well. You're helping the outside world. So thank you for sharing that with us. Now, sort of pivoting a little bit to your personal life, you have two kids, a 17-year-old and an 11-and-a-half-year-old. What do you enjoy doing as a family to unwind?
Well, that's changed over the years, because as we've now got a teenager and a tweener.
Right.
Life is very different from having little kids. But both my sons have real interests, and my older one's very into music and he writes music. The younger one's very into tinkering. So we'll do a little bit of what they're interested in with them. We'll cook a meal, hang out, play board games, very kind of low key stuff. But we try and spend a lot of time together as family. But as I said, as they get older, it evolves. But they have very distinct interests, so we try to participate, or at least listen to what they're interested in.
Yeah, no, I love that, and you kind of enjoy doing that many pursuits together. Thanks for that. And before we let you go, are there any words or advice you could share with our viewers today? Any young women who would love to kind of follow in your footsteps?
A couple of things I would think. First of all, your career path is probably likely, especially today, but even for me, not to be linear. So to be prepared for that and to be open to change, because things will change. The second is, it's great to want a career in finance, and I think it's very good to develop a network of friends, mentors, etc., who are in that space, so you can kind of use them as benchmarks or reference points.
Yeah.
But to be clear why you want to be in it, and to make sure you're not doing a job that is in some way very and then, there's dozens of different kinds of jobs in finance. So also to pick the right job that fits your personality, strengths, and your aptitude, but also to be clear as to what those are and how they might change over time, and to be willing to follow that. Because in my experience, having managed a lot of people, mentored people, gone through my own career, it's very hard to sustain something that is not consistent with who you are. And you can do it for a short period of time, and we all have, but then being willing to move on to something new is very important. So, I kind of went from a rating agency to a credit derivative business to an investment business. And the thread through that has been my willingness to kind of change and take risk, but they're very different content jobs. And so I think that openness to change is really important. I think change is going to happen, especially for younger women today. So I would say seek out mentors, be prepared for change. Don't expect kind of a steady path. And then just really recognize who you are at that moment in time and try and adjust your business life to accommodate that, which will probably be more likely to lead to happiness and success.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Romita, for sharing your tremendous journey with us today. Romita Shetty, Managing Director of DA Capital. And thank you to our viewers for joining us on this empowerment journey today. We want you all to embrace that inner goddess of go-getting. We want you to be bold, be you, be Uma.